American refugees. They're not coming in dribs and drabs, they're coming in waves. That's a line I heard recently on a podcast. It was a real estate podcast by a British guy who works as an agent somewhere down the coast. American refugees. He wasn't apparently using the expression ironically, because he also talked about all the British refugees he helped post-Brexit, and how it's impossible to compare that with the current American refugee situation. It was all part of his sales pitch. So, what exactly brings so many American refugees to Spain? Apparently, they're just tired of every conversation being about politics. Oh yeah, and the sunshine and tapas, and the lower cost of living. Hey everybody, it's Daniel. Welcome back to Spain to Go, the best podcast in the entire multiverse for all things Spain. This is episode 135, and it's about American refugees. I am, as you can probably tell, not fully convinced by the use of the word refugee to describe most of the situations I will be talking about in this article, but I heard it on this real estate podcast and thought, one way or another, I've got to write about it, and here we are. Shout out today to Phil. Phil is in Essex and London. He says, dedicated listener here, not missed one episode. You make Spain feel real and nuanced. I am Essex and London based, an engineer, now Spanish thanks to my abuela, swapping London life for the Alpujarras with El Bebe and a Spanish culture project on the way. Thank you very much, Phil. I appreciate you listening to the podcast. Elsewhere, Phil sent me a message saying that he's literally been listening since the first episode. I don't know if he means that he found this in August of 2020 and started listening then. It's been a long time since I started doing this. Anyway, Phil made a donation over at expatmadrid.com/donate. You can also donate on expatmadrid.com/donate. I appreciate it greatly. Any amount helps. You can go from 10 euros all the way on up to however much you want. expatmadrid.com/donate. I'll give you a shout out in a future episode. So thank you very much, Phil, and thank you to all of my donors, past and present. I appreciate you. Let's get back to refugees. Because hearing about American refugees made me think, what is a refugee anyway? A refugee, according to the American Heritage Dictionary, is one who flees, especially to another country, seeking refuge from war, political oppression, religious persecution, or a natural disaster. Different countries have different criteria for accepting and processing refugees. It looks like anyone can apply for political asylum and eventually get a hearing, but it may be difficult to prove your refugee status once you're in another country. Apparently, according to The Guardian and other sources, which we will get to later, refugees have to prove, 1, that their life and or freedoms are under serious threat. For example, they've been imprisoned or tortured in their home country. 2, that they've been to the authorities in their country and the authorities can't or won't help them. And 3, that they have no safe place to go within their own country. That brief list, like I said, is paraphrased from an article in The Guardian and some other places. We will be hearing more from The Guardian in a moment. In any case, what sticks out there is that sunshine and tapas are not on the list of criteria for achieving refugee status. A lower cost of living was also not contemplated in the 1951 UN Refugee Convention. As usual, this is not legal advice. Talk to a lawyer. Anyway, plenty of Americans do want to move to Spain these days, and there are several ways to do so, whether you're working online, living off passive income, or fleeing from political oppression. But what does it take to start a new life in Europe? I've done it, and it's not easy, although things tend to get significantly easier if you have money. Online, wealthy Americans hoping to retire at the beach are outraged by YouTube videos suggesting that you can get by in Spain on $2,600 a month. It's unrealistic, they think, to get by on so little. And maybe it is, for them, But the average Spanish salary is about 28,000 euros per year, which, after the exchange rate, works out to just about $2,600 a month. So there are plenty of Spanish families getting by on that, and on much less. Of course, it all depends on what you mean by get by, and what you mean by in Spain. If your lifestyle involves you buying a townhouse within 50 meters of the beach in Costa Brava or Marbella, you're going to need a lot more money. Similarly, if your life includes any sort of luxury, travel, or frequent dining out. On the other hand, there are plenty of places in rural Spain, away from the coasts, where $2,600 or euros a month is a very good salary. Getting by for most people in the world is a lot more minimalist than what middle-class Americans are used to. Consider the fact that if you're making around $60,000 a year, you are actually in the global 1%. I bet you didn't know that, but in reality, well over half the people on the planet get by on less than $10 a day. The Western world is pretty small compared to Asia and Africa, and most of us out here are doing just fine, especially if we expand our view to include countries beyond the US, Europe, and the Anglosphere. So what does it take to live comfortably as an American in Spain? In a post on his blog, the podcaster I mentioned at the start of this article says that a couple can live comfortably in Spain on 3,000 to 5,000 euros monthly. That seems more realistic for people with a middle-class lifestyle in the US. When I wrote about social class in Spain, I found that anyone making over 1,000 euros a month can consider themselves middle class around here. So at 3,000 to 5,000, you're solidly upper middle, if not upper class. Another thing I discovered while writing that article is that virtually no one identifies as being upper class. If you want to know much, much more, check out episode 87 of this podcast. That is Social Class in Spain. I talk about income distributions, what it takes to become middle or upper class. I talk about royalty, etc. Social class is complicated and we don't talk about it much, but maybe we should. In the podcast on the American Exodus, this same blogger and podcaster mentions a family from Austin, Texas, who sold their house for just over $1 million and who found that in Valencia, their money went a lot further. Typical refugee stuff. Apparently, and still according to the same podcast, it's called the Valencia Property Podcast in case you want to check it out, a lot of people feel like the American dream they've been sold is a lie. It's actually an American treadmill, and they can't get off. But actually, the whole premise of this guy's podcast is that you can get off and move to Spain and hire him as a real estate agent and go on to live a life of relative luxury on much less than you could back home. In fact, despite the American dream being nothing but one big lie, the number of Americans who can afford early retirement or a non-lucrative visa based on passive income is quite large. And if you're able to work remotely, there's a visa for digital nomads too. Lots of options, in other words, for escaping the US and coming to Spain. Check out my friend Seppi's Ultimate Visa Guide to Living in Europe for much more on that. I will put a link in the show notes. She talks about Spain in that guide, but also there are a lot of other countries here in Europe that might have easier visa processes. A lot of people, like Phil at the beginning of this episode, have a grandparent or something similar from a European country and can sometimes get a European nationality that way. There are lots of ways in if you have a tolerance for bureaucracy. Anyway, that's the Ultimate Visa Guide to Living in Europe. Link in the show notes. Let's talk about refugees of the gender wars. I first came across the idea of American refugees last year when I read about an individual who had gone to the Netherlands and checked into a refugee camp, claiming persecution back home. The reason? The US had become unsafe for identities across the queer spectrum. So this individual had lawyers arguing that they were forced to seek asylum due to the Nazi Germany-like conditions suffered by LGBTQs in America. Their application for asylum was eventually denied, When I followed up recently, I found more stories pointing to a trend of Americans doing this, and by this I mean moving into Dutch refugee camps. Apparently, the number of Americans who have flown to Europe to claim refugee status in the last few years is small but increasing. It's now at least several dozen. The criteria for refugee status that I mentioned earlier were from an article in The Guardian about this topic. You can Google around and find more information if you would like. One person in the Guardian article claims that the experience of living in San Francisco was, except for the robot taxis, quote, indistinguishable from that of the people I knew from Libya and Iran and Morocco and Algeria. I think that's a bit of an exaggeration, of course. I've heard that Libya has gotten pretty rough in the last few years, but it can't be half as bad as San Francisco. San Francisco, where a dog can't even walk down the street without stepping in human poop. Presumably, there are long backlogs of cases in asylum courts around Europe, and the judges will patiently work their way through the applications to decide who is genuinely fleeing persecution and who's not. I wish everyone the best, but legal experts quoted in various media suggest that the U.S. is generally considered a safe country wherever you are on the queer spectrum, so they doubt whether U.S. asylum seekers will ultimately succeed. Side note here, that last they is plural, referring to legal experts, which I realize is confusing in the midst of so many singular theys. I apologize for that. Grammar is just one of the many victims of the gender wars. Let's talk about the world's most privileged victims. Because defining yourself by your wealth or privilege is kind of cringe in most circles, at least now in the 2020s. But defining yourself by real or imagined oppression is perfectly acceptable. So in the modern West, even the very wealthy now claim to be struggling outcasts, oppressed minorities, victims of political tyranny. Actors like Susan Sarandon come to Spain and give speeches about the censorship and repression they have escaped from by coming to the red carpet gala at the Goya Awards. So strong, so brave. Susan Sarandon has an estimated net worth of $60 million, which in New York will get you a pastrami bagel and a small drip coffee. I know because I was there last year. Actually, I would rather be in a refugee camp than spend another week in Manhattan, but I digress. Richard Gere has gone even further than Susan Sarandon, buying an €11 million home in La Moraleja, the most expensive Madrid suburb, in order to escape from America. He's now frequently quoted in the Spanish press talking about how Donald Trump has destroyed his country. Last year, he gave an interview in his spacious home to El País. The title of the article is Life Isn't About Money or Power, but about love and affection. Easy to say when you're sitting in your €11 million mansion. Richard Gere's net worth is estimated at $120 million. The fawning tone of articles in the Spanish press about these celebrities and their struggles with oppression makes me want to puke, but maybe it's just me. Believe it or not, I have my own story of a flight from oppression. I moved to Spain with a backpack and a small duffel bag. In those days, I considered t-shirts from Target to be pretty nice semi-formal attire, so I had several in that black duffel. I wanted to look my best. For Europe. The most expensive clothing purchase of my life up to that point was a pair of Doc Martens boots, which was what I was wearing as my only pair of shoes. I had worn them around the Arizona desert for a year or so at that point. Buying Doc Martens on my 2004 salary was painful. I worked as a barista for $6 an hour plus tips, and tips in that failing cafe, frequented by college students and the homeless, were not abundant. When I arrived in Madrid, I was feeling pretty bad about stuff back home. George W. Bush was president. American militarism was ruining the world. I had learned all about it from Rage Against the Machine. In my early 20s, about half my personality was made up of Rage Against the Machine lyrics. Land of the free, whoever told you that was your enemy. And for a few months over in Europe, I really felt like I was fleeing from something. But as I stayed on in Madrid, working under the table and struggling to get legal with the Spanish government, I met all kinds of people. I realized that my problems were actually quite small, and that, in fact, I was exceedingly lucky to be American. The U.S. has one of the world's strongest passports. Our economy is second to none, and even speaking English is a gift that not everyone in the world enjoys. My wife, Morena from South India, says she would still be back on the banana farm if she hadn't been able to learn a good level of English. And almost every immigrant I've met here in Spain dreams of someday making it to the U.S. for a better life. Maybe they're onto something. Maybe Rage Against the Machine was wrong. But let's wrap this up with a few final thoughts on the American exodus to Spain. I am grateful to have grown up in the U.S. I am also grateful for my life in Spain, which has provided me with opportunities and experiences I wouldn't have had back home. I'm even grateful for my struggles, first as a kid just scraping by out in the Arizona desert, and later as an undocumented migrant in Madrid. But these days, the U.S. seems to create large numbers of people who live in million-dollar homes and who assume that the whole economy is working against them. And a lot of them want to come to Spain for a better lifestyle. They get on Facebook groups to find out about the rates for shipping containers so they can bring all their kitchen gadgets and their furniture. The conversations about booking overseas flights for dogs and cats are interminable. I've even seen people asking how to ship their horses. Like I said, they want the sun, the tapas, and the more relaxed lifestyle. They want to get away from it all, especially the political arguments. Hopefully they won't just bring it all with them. That's about all I've got for today. I hope you are having a great day wherever you are out there in the world. On the blog, expatmadrid.com, I always write a series of final thoughts as PS and PPS on the post in question. So let me just talk about a couple of extra things that did not make it into this episode of the podcast, but should have. U.S. politics is very annoying, but from what I've learned about other countries in my time abroad, so is politics everywhere else. Spain is not perfect. Try having Pedro Sanchez as president for several years. It's no picnic. Pedro Sanchez is actually the topic of my previous episode, episode 134, if you would like to know all of the reasons why myself and many other Spaniards do not enjoy having the government run by Pedro Sanchez. You can check that out. Don't forget to subscribe to the podcast in your podcast app. I make a new episode every week or two, just depending on what's happening. Despite the tone of this article and podcast, I am actually not against making lots of money. I've written about financial independence on the blog. I don't have any podcast episodes about it, but there's a link on the blog to my guide to financial independence and retiring early. If you're into that kind of thing, you might be. It's at least an interesting movement from the past several years. And I don't have any problem with earning money. I do think it's important to be grateful because most people in the world have next to nothing. While we're here talking about who is and is not a refugee, it's worth mentioning that people also like to debate the difference between expats and immigrants. That has an episode of the podcast, I believe. Episode 15, Expats and Immigrants and Geres. Oh my. I use both words, expat and immigrant, depending on my mood. I don't care very much about the debate. If you move to Spain, you will at some point get yelled at for using the word America wrong or the word American wrong. Somebody will definitely point out that America is one continent extending all the way from Alaska and Canada down to Chile and Argentina, and that if you call yourself an American just because you're from the US, you're some sort of bigot. I don't know. That's something I've been through many times, and I've talked about it on the podcast as well. That is episode 98, America, a Country and a Continent. While we're on the topic, one of my favorite stories of the last several years has been the one about American digital nomads moving to Mexico for a better life, much to the chagrin of the locals. It's funny on so many levels. but it's also part of a general trend. International travel has gotten cheaper and much more mainstream. Banks are more comfortable sending money abroad, so you can get oat milk lattes everywhere. Capitalism has made a lot of things easier, even complaining about capitalism. If Zach De La Rocha of Rage Against the Machine were starting his career today, he would be one of those TikTokers who sits in his car crying. That is about all I've got for today. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Please head over to expatmadrid.com/donate and send some money my way. expatmadrid.com/donate. I'll give you a shout out in my next episode. And of course, you can attach a question or comment to your donation, and I'll be very likely to answer your question if you send it to me that way. So expatmadrid.com/donate. If you're living in Spain, if you're moving to Spain, if you're traveling through Barcelona, let me know. I'm happy to meet up for a coffee with a wide variety of people. I met up with previous donors, Nancy and Glenn, several weeks ago. That was a lot of fun. I've got a dinner date with Bob coming up in a few days here. Bob has donated multiple times, and I met up with him and his friend Bob when they were last in Barcelona, which might have been like a year or two ago now. I don't know. Time flies when you're having fun. Anyway, I don't mean to tell you about my whole social calendar, but if you are in Barcelona for whatever reason, figure out how to send me a message on Instagram or send me an email or whatever through the blog. There's lots of ways to reach me, and let me know. If our schedules align, we might be able to meet up. Head on over to YouTube if you would like. I've got a channel over there called Learn Spanish with Daniel. I'm teaching Spanish. My two latest videos are the word cita, which is an important thing in Spanish life. It's a date or an appointment. Cita in its various uses. And then yesterday I made a new video which is about the word invitar. Invitar is sometimes invite, but it's sometimes something else that you need to know about, so you don't get into awkward social situations by misunderstanding what someone means by invitar. So head on over to YouTube and look for Learn Spanish with Daniel. I think you could probably just put youtube.com/Learn Spanish with Daniel into your browser and get there that way too. There are lots of ways to find me. Anyway, that's it. Have a great day. Thank you for listening, and I will talk to you soon. Desde la hermosa ciudad de Barcelona. Hasta la próxima. Bye.